Hi everybody, welcome to the FSP podcast. My name's Tim, and today we'll be talking about navigating the new digital landscape. If you haven't checked out our previous podcast on the new digital landscape presented by Simon Walker, please check it out at the link below. Today I'm joined by three of my FSP colleagues, and they'll introduce themselves now.
Thanks, Tim. I'm James Butler, been at FSP for about 3 years. I lead our team that does work around IT strategy, digital strategy, helping shape complex transformations, and also a lot of work around data strategy.
Hiya, I'm Hawkins. I've been at FSP now for 7 years. So as James said, his team helps clients with the definition of their strategy, where my role would much be more around helping clients transform their organisations to align to that strategy.
Hi there, I'm Ryan Smith. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer here at FSP, and it's my responsibility to support our customers in ensuring that their data remains safe, and also I get to wear a second hat of making sure that all of our data and services are safe and delivered correctly.
Thank you all. So today we're going to be talking about the new digital landscape. I think one of the things that's been clear to me over the last few years is how IT organisations have evolved from being purely sort of these centres where operations get done, people make sure servers are running, that they've got, laptops that can access the internet, and that was sort of the pure focus of IT organisations, to much more being this organisation that is relied on by the whole of a business to make sure that they are pushing forward, that they're adopting everything that the world has to offer them. They're often involved in having to think about where does revenue come from for the business, or if it's a government organisation, how they serve citizens in the best way possible. And it's very focused around what would have been in the past IT departments. I think the new digital landscape, being the intersection of transformation, obviously IT operations and technology, but also more recently cyber, data, and then, in the last year or so, AI being added to that responsibility. There's a lot of responsibility, I think, that these organisations are taking on. And I think it'd be interesting to get all your viewpoints today on how can organisations really, take on that challenge and meet it head on in the best way possible. So I guess one of the things that struck me, and I know James, we were talking about this a little while ago, digital transformation now is much less about just moving paper processes into online systems or digital systems, and much more about full organisational transformation. Be interesting to hear your thoughts on how that's sort of taking off at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. You know what I'm like. I like the big picture thing, and for me, this is a trend that started a long time ago with the sort of the internet and things like that, but it's really exploded in the last 10 years. I think it's still accelerating. And so the one thing that you have to do first and foremost is invest in your people. If you want to be able to cope with these waves of change, you mentioned AI as the latest thing that's come along. There'll be something else. Maybe in a few years' time it'll be quantum, and that'll finally hit businesses, probably not quickly. But if you want to be able to cope with all of this, the one thing you need is to have the right skills in your people and the right ability to take advantage of them. So we'll come back to all of these things as we go through the conversation, but I think that's the one sort of thing that is absolutely crucial. And what I still see is that most of the customers we work with, they still have that split that you were talking about, the split of IT department from the rest of the business, and seeing these things as still very, very separate. And actually, when you get really digital, what you need is for the business to go on a digital and IT skills journey just as much as the IT department, because the IT needs to start, and the data needs to start being owned by the business. They need to start being in control of what happens with it and able to make informed and intelligent decisions.
Yeah, definitely. See that being the case. And I think, while the business is building up more skills, there's also a need for business people to be much closer to what's happening in the world of digital delivery. And that's been quite a trend I've seen.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is that the gap between IT and business is getting much and much smaller, and there's a blend now where you can talk to people from a business perspective and they fully understand how digital products are going to completely enable their operations, where previously it was like the IT team in the corner that just did some stuff.
Yeah, or in many cases, I think we've got those examples of like shadow IT, where the IT department can't do what the business needs, and then you end up with the business going off, or parts of the business going off, just doing what they want. I think those really successful digital organisations, or those who are becoming more successful, you see it being much more of a partnership.
Yeah, and that is the key thing, I think, bringing the whole organisation on one digital journey.
And I think that's where the problem of shadow IT has come from, right? It has come from a business requirement that they don't feel is being served by a traditional IT department facility within that organisation, because otherwise fundamentally they wouldn't have done it, and there might be different reasons for it. They might have thought it took too much time, there was too much governance, there was a myriad of different reasons as to why they might not do it, but fundamentally that was the business showing a need that they weren't getting delivered to them what was required. Otherwise it would have just been part of the business.
Yeah, and I think that's certainly the case for businesses that have been established for a period of time, because and I guess this new digital landscape has really been shaped by some of these disruptors in the last 10 years or so coming along, the Airbnbs, the Spotifys, those sorts of organisations that have really turned whole industries on their heads. And then, big established organisations, blockbusters, obviously the canonical example, have had to either adopt or genuinely go extinct. And I guess that's something where now for many organisations in the UK, or maybe been established over a period of time, that need to learn how to adapt more quickly is really key.
Yeah, when we were sort of chatting through previously, what might we talk about? I mean, one of the things that came up that I think is really interesting, to your point, is this whole thing around how digital works at every level. It works at the personal level, but it works at the organisational strategy level and the market level. So you need to be having these digital conversations all the way from the boardroom right down to the day-to-day and operations of how everyone's working. So it's a really sort of fundamental shift. When you see the digital businesses like Netflix or Airbnb, digital is everywhere. The whole thing is digital. I mean, it's property, but it's an IT digital business throughout every single part of it. And so that sort of digital perspective has been baked in there at every level, from where do you fit in the market and what's your fundamental point of advantage as a business, right down to every single task is automated and digital by default. And that's just the opposite of a traditional business. So trying to figure out how do you get to be a really sustainable digital business in every sense requires these conversations to happen at all levels.
Yeah, I think...
I was going to say that's a really good point, because actually leadership is one of the biggest things in my experience that will make the biggest difference between where an organisation can fall from a digital perspective. So if you've got a CFO that still wants a conventional business case for every pound you spend, it's going to be really difficult to move forward from a digital perspective. And if the corporate governance doesn't enable change to happen very quickly, then again, it's going to be very difficult to go very fast at all. And ultimately, from a digital perspective, you are just having to keep up with the requirements of the business. And if you can't, they will get it from somewhere else. So I guess one of the challenges for digital teams across all organisations is how do they fully enable themselves from a leadership perspective, from a governance perspective, and from a skill set and organisational perspective, to be able to keep up with what somebody could go and buy from the marketplace. So they need to be the best option, not the only option.
And I think that's where, I mean, you mentioned governance a couple of times there, but in terms of, we've mentioned people, but in terms of process, if you are still using process designed 10 or 15 years ago that was very static change, there wasn't a lot of incremental or even sizable change happening at pace, you don't have guardrails in place. What you have to do is every time you go to move a data set or bring on a new service or subscription or some sort, you're going to end up in a place where you're never going to have enough people to be able to put their arms around this and make sure that it's governed and delivered correctly. You're going to be in a position where we're back to shadow IT. People are just going, this is too hard and too difficult. I'm not going to do it. I don't know what bounds I can operate in that. And that might be financial bounds, it might be governance, risk and compliance, it could be data, it could be security, it could be any of those things. But if you don't have the ability to set those guardrails in place and do the thinking up front, and you have to do your thinking every time someone wants to make a change within the business, the change just won't be there.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of key sort of points that have come out there around business cases, governance. We might come back to in in a little while. I think one of the interesting things for me is the role of the IT organisation changing, and that's not, that's in all parts of IT. So you see it in people who are infrastructure engineers, maybe being expected now to be thinking much more about automation and thinking about resilience of what they're creating rather than maybe more traditional infrastructure engineering tasks. And the other one that's really interesting for me is cybersecurity, how that's changed, especially in organisations like government organisations or financial services organisations where information security or information assurance or cybersecurity was a place where people would have to go to get an approval, and it became, many places call it like the Department of No, or other things like that. It'd be interesting to see how does that become more of a partnership with the business? How does it become more about being an enabling function for the business rather than just this blocker that stands in the way?
I think it goes back to what I was saying about guardrails and having an understanding of what it is that the business is trying to achieve. So if you're in a position organisationally where you've got a raft of very technical SMEs when it comes to cybersecurity, that's great if you are impacting a change here, a thing there on top of something that you own. Most of this digital transformation now is a service that somebody is consuming from somebody else. It could be an Amazon, it could be a Google, it could be a Microsoft. There are things that you can do in those places, but fundamentally, when you get down to the core of the infrastructure and what you're consuming, you just do not have the control that you would have previously had. You can't put those things in place. So I do think, how do you ensure that this works and you don't end up being the people that just say no to everything? It's about moving away, not completely from those type of individuals, but you are going to have people who are a lot more understanding of what the digital landscape looks like now and that sort of consumption of services, because it's not necessarily going to be, I'm going to put a control here or a stop there or a block somewhere else. It's going to be more down to actually commercially, when I'm working with another organisation, contractually, where are we? What controls do we have in place? Because it comes a lot more to the third party management at that point of whom you're getting the service from, because you're no longer delivering that service into your business anymore.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because I was thinking while you were talking, this sort of links with both what you were saying, the whole going faster point, the need to put your governance in different places. And, as we want to work within more of this sort of digital ecosystem, so everything's in the cloud, it's a zero trust environment, and we probably need to explain that because I don't think everyone knows what zero trust is. But you need a completely different architecture for security, and you need to do it in different places. So, as you said, the whole sort of supply chain focus on governance and security, but also if you're going to go faster, you have to move those guardrails down into your delivery processes, hence the whole DevSecOps thing. So we've just got a couple of nice bits of jargon there we could unpack, but those are like really important concepts in this shift, aren't they? Because these are things, if anything, we've learned from those digital companies that if you want to go a lot faster, you have to sort of learn from the whole way that development life cycles have changed as we've evolved agile over the last 20 years, put security into those, put business knowledge into them. So that's why often we have these multidisciplinary teams, called them fusion teams and similar. So you have to do all of these things together if you want to go faster. And if you only do one bit of it, then security is on the outside saying no, or supply chain don't understand and don't help you manage your suppliers. So it's a really massive change to put all of that together if you want to genuinely go faster.
And we do see that a lot, whereas businesses are still trying to operate in that way that they often did, certainly from a GRC, certainly from a cybersecurity standpoint. They're trying to be able to impact that change. We build the big walled gardens, we put all of our data inside that thing, we made sure they were really, really high and hoped that nobody could get in them, but that's not what happens anymore. Now you pick your data up, you move your data across lots of different suppliers, and therefore you need to be able to protect that information where it resides, and you might not have an awful lot of control on it. And equally, if the business has already made the decision that it's going there, again, we're back to, you're going to have a very different cybersecurity infrastructure within your organisation to be able to deal with the challenges that presents, opposed to, okay, we did something we didn't like, but we could put a new firewall in next week and I'm sure that will sort it out.
So go on, Ryan, give us a minute on what is zero trust then.
So,
Sorry.
I knew that was going to come up. So Some people see it as a nirvana. I've met quite a few people who think that they came up with the idea. I think zero trust, very much for me, if I was to look at it as a single underlying principle, is for every piece of infrastructure, every data asset, everything that you have. We used to previously, again, back to the walled garden, we had it all in an environment which we looked after. Zero trust is that data is now somewhere else. And I have to ensure that the only people that have access to that data, that information, that infrastructure are those who should. And I'm going to prove it each time that individual, that identity, that account gains access to that thing.
Yeah. The really, really simple analogy I like to think of is like, high trust is you've got your front door key and you go into your house, and once you've opened your front door, you're literally into everything. Where zero trust is everywhere in your house there's sensors that know if you're allowed to see or touch a certain thing, and then you can pick it up or you can interact with it. The fridge only opens if it's dad, not if it's the kids. That's sort of
Is that how
I
your
think
fridge
that's just
opens?
in your house.
Yeah, that's pretty much it in my house. Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the interesting things you brought up about digital literacy earlier, and I think it's sort of linked with this, this general topic. We've got a challenge with digital and data literacy in businesses in general. We see it every day, organisations where people don't really understand their own data. Conversely, we've also got a generation of people coming into the workplace who are used to, operating everything digitally, actually have probably some reasonably, in some cases, robust practices around things like security. And I think one of the interesting moves from maybe that sort of walled garden approach, the Department of No in cybersecurity, that needs to happen into the future. A good simple example for me is guidance around passwords. So if you think about passwords sort of 10, 15 years ago, everyone used to say you need to have, 15 characters, make sure there's a symbol in there, make sure there's a capital letter, a number, a lowercase letter. Whereas now, much more conventional guidance is, use a phrase that you'll remember and, use that to build up a much more robust, longer password. Those kind of things that are, I guess, start to bring down friction for people, but also increase security. Those are really good signs of a organisation, I think, that's starting to embrace a more modern way of working, or even now passwordless systems and things like that. And I think this is where actually it can become a much more integrated team between data, AI, technology, cyber that enables the business rather than hinders the business. That feels like a good overall aim, and maybe if organisations are thinking of sort of what their IT organisations are thinking about what their reason to be should be, maybe that's something that could be key to that.
I think the Department of No phrase is really interesting because it's not just used at cybersecurity. I find it lots of organisations I work with would actually say their digital teams are the Department of No when they go with a requirement. So they then just go with a credit card and buy it somewhere else. And I guess that is what we need to try and mitigate, because no matter what controls and guardrails you put in place, if there's no control over what people are going out and purchasing and then putting corporate data into, you're back to square one.
So should we think of some ideas then that, okay, so if an organisation was doing this well, if they were navigating the digital landscape well, what might governance look like in an organisation like that? Because I guess if I was to think about the old approach would be lots of stage gates. You need to
love a stage gate.
You need to maybe create a outline business case to get your first piece of funding, and then a more robust and substantial business case, and then you get through your next gate, and then you need to create a design.
Yeah.
How do we think this might look in a more progressive organisation?
Well, I think the most important part there would be around how organisations think about investment, because the traditional investment would be like, tell me what you're going to do and then I'll give you some money. And I want to know exactly what the outcomes are going to be. And actually, in a more digital landscape, there needs to be more investment in the foundations to enable you to deliver faster. So I think that's a really key thing around. There may not always be a very tangible return on investment for things like making the technology landscape more simpler. I can't even say that word. Simple. And that means that you can then put a pace of change through that landscape, but also investing in things like digital and data literacy in an organisation, and investing in things like having business change teams that actually engage with the business.
You see, I slightly disagree with you on some of the positioning. We had this last time, we talked about it as well. It's not that there isn't like a really straightforward business case for doing this. It's that the business case for really big transformation, like investing in a much more digital capability, is not going to be justified unless you're fundamentally changing the business. So, if you go and build data lake and deploy AI and build digital teams, and then you're still just trying to work with the same documents in SharePoint, only slightly better, you're never going to justify things. So you've got to be trying to really do something to your business model, and something at quite a strategic level, if you're going to justify those sorts of really, really big investments.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think it's just when you are doing those big investments, but in piecemeal transformation projects, instead of actually looking at the fundamental underlying landscape and trying to put the right building blocks in place, that you can then put all of that on top of it.
Yeah, in practice, we see lots of customers stuck in exactly this stage,
Yeah,
where they
this
just
is
can't
the
figure
sticky
out
bit.
the business case to be much more digital. And so they end up doing the same sorts of things, using the same sorts of delivery processes with small tweaks, and trying to put square pegs in round holes, trying to plug something that seems very digital into the rest of their business and struggling to prove the ROI. And I think it's generally that customers don't step back far enough and go, what's the fundamental shift we're trying to make? And what's both the sort of value drivers and the business benefits in doing that? Because if you're not trying to fundamentally change your business processes and end user ways of working, you're probably not going to see the return out of all of this. And that means you need to have a very clear idea of what's the reason we try and be more digital. If it is just a very slightly better, very slightly cheaper version of what you already do, then you're potentially going to try and spend a lot of money for 2% efficiency improvement.
Yeah, it starts to become like a building faster horses, right? At that point, you are just taking the same thing, you're re-engineering it. I think the point you made, Faye, about sort of investing in the underlying technology landscape, building the platform. I think a few years ago, there's this phrase sort of fix the plumbing in your business. That was sort of something that was really key. I think, as you say, you otherwise get into this problem where every business case is trying to fix something really fundamental in the business, and therefore the cost of a business case becomes really high because you're having to fix something really fundamental that the business is probably underinvested in order to gain this benefit, and you can't justify the benefit on one thing alone.
And the funny thing is, with some digital stuff, you can start pretty small and move pretty quickly, and that drives a lot of learning.
Yeah.
So sometimes you need to do it more as a sort of innovation and experimental.
Yeah. So what do you think experimentation? What role do you think experimentation should play in like the reframe of business cases or governance?
That's a really big question.
That's why I came to a really big brain for that big question.
Thanks, very kind of you. Look, if you're not ever stepping back and thinking, can we work fundamentally differently as a business, you're probably waiting for someone else to put you out of business, and starting to try and build some capability in the organisation that would allow you to do things fundamentally differently is actually quite a powerful way of making sure you don't miss that opportunity. So doing some investment which joins up the platform and technology level up through how do you work, up back into what do we do as a business, is really important. I mean, basically every business should do that. If you're not doing it, you're waiting for someone else to do it to you.
Yeah.
And we have really good proven approaches for how you run this stuff. So Tim's original question around, I think, how do you organise yourselves? Was that the original question?
Yeah.
Kind of forgetting.
Yeah, how might we rethink governance? Yeah.
I mean, I think you're totally right about the investment point, but one of the other points I bring in around how you execute are these ideas around how you can be much more iterative and deliver much more frequently. And at a sort of tech level, we talk about agile, the big A rather than the small A. It's not being flexible. It's being really structured, just to make that clear. But on a sort of slightly bigger picture level, there's these ideas around being product-centric, and you can apply those sorts of ideas to really almost any sort of business problem. It doesn't have to be a product out in the market. And again, there's really good theory and process and best practices around how you do this stuff so that you can, be very, very rigorous with what success looks like, with proving the business case, with keeping your focus on end users. And that goes through to how do you run workshops and through discovery? How do you manage your delivery and prove the value of what you're doing? It's a really, really well-developed area of practice. And it's quite rare I see businesses doing this in a fundamental and widespread way.
Yeah,
but you can test and learn and then scale out. And I think that was kind of joining up that point with starting small and learning. So
that idea of product centricity, just to pause on that for a minute, because I think that's worth unpacking a little bit. So this is where organisations move from short-term investment cycles, thinking about a project, so where you might think about, I need to implement an ERP, and you stand up a project and you deliver that, to much more thinking about, actually we've got a long-term investment in a product or a platform in our business, and we need to have an ongoing investment in this, and therefore a capability within the business to keep on iterating and improving this product. That's sort of the underlying thinking. One of the interesting things to me in that is how that brings together different functions in the business, because if that's done really well, you should have a fusion team. I think you used the word earlier, James.
Multidisciplinary teams.
Yeah, multidisciplinary team that can bring together that capability from the business, from technology, from testing, from operations, cybersecurity. I mean, that's been an interesting thing we've been working on recently, in terms of how do you bring all those functions together and make it actually something that can rapidly create improved capability in the business, but it's very much by everybody working together. And it'd be interesting to see where do you see that approach in how it makes organisations more secure, not less secure, why it's better practice rather than just creating sort of a environment for people to work around the problem.
Yeah, I think to sort of James's point really, which is if you don't go and do this stuff, it's going to be done unto you. So if the governance team, the cybersecurity team, the data privacy team aren't part of one of these multidisciplinary teams, they're only going to find out after the thing has happened. So actually building these fusion teams, having this product-centric view really supports the security, because it's not something has happened and then you're having to do something about it. Again, back to probably more to do with supply chain management these days and third-party management. If you're actually part of that team up front, you know where the business is trying to head, because you've got that business input into the product team, so you know what they're trying to achieve. And actually, sometimes people will come up with the wrong decisions, and it might be a very close, almost 50-50 decision that's being made by the business on do they take product and service A or B, whereas actually there could be something underlying in that where if the security team is part of that conversation during that, they actually can steer it in the right direction that stops that problem occurring later down the line. It could be something as simple as data residency. Okay, you've got two services that are almost identical and it's almost a flick of the coin, but actually someone just says, yeah, for this contract, we need that to be in the UK. And then you don't have this problem of someone's invested a lot of time, money and effort into getting the business case signed off, trying to deploy the funds and doing all of that piece, and then trying to do something about it, which, again, fundamentally you're back to if you're taking a service provision from someone and they don't facilitate that for you, well, you've got a problem at that stage. The business has already done it.
I think what's really interesting as well is that you have to do this through the whole life cycle at every single part of it, and also at all levels of decision making, from how do we run this business process? How do we keep it secure, manage people's data correctly? Why is that more effective for us? And then at the delivery level. So you need to integrate these different areas of thinking, like security and data protection, both from strategy through to delivery, because at the sort of tech end, it is how do you build it into that development life cycle and all the rest of it. But also through that whole continuously evolving life cycle of your product, whatever that product it is. Could be a business process, a service, an actual thing you sell. It's really interesting how digital forces these different ways of working.
I think one of the other things that operating with that product mindset helps is, and if we were to go all the way back up to the top level and say, what do you need to be able to do this? Well, actually, you need trust in your business. It needs to be a high trust environment, because if it isn't, you're straight down to what's every rule, what's every regulation. You're trying to stop the business doing something because innately you think the wrong decision's going to be made. And I'm not even talking about that from a security standpoint. I'm actually going all the way up to when people are setting budgets and alike, and budget holders are sat there. If they're not trusted to deliver the right outcomes from the organisation with that money, there'll be far more scrutiny. And again, scrutiny normally breeds to lots of governance, lots of risk, lots of compliance gates. We're back to the gates section.
I said we love a stage gate.
You love a stage gate, Faye, I know this. So you're back to this struggle, which is the business wants to move forward, but if you don't have trust in that business and you don't have the right guardrails in place, fundamentally you're back to square one. You're just doing what you were doing 10 to 15 years ago, just with some new technology.
So I think in summary, if people talk to each other, it's better. That's what you're saying.
Yes, it's good to talk.
Zero trust and high trust is what I'm getting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There you go. All the ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, I'm very confused. I think that one of the key things that we haven't touched on very much here is around the people and culture that's actually needed for any of this stuff to work. Because, I mean, having a high trust organisation, you don't just wake up one morning and everyone trusts each other and they think everyone's going to be doing all the right things and going in the right direction. That does take a period of time and actual interventions to be made, supporting leadership to I think actually one of the biggest issues I see in organisations is leadership not even trusting each other and being on the same page. And so how can they then cascade that through the organisation? So I do think the cultural aspect is huge, which is led by the leaders of the organisation, and it's almost a bit can't think of the right word now. It's almost impossible to move forward from a digital perspective if your organisation isn't ready to change from a culture perspective.
That's a really interesting insight, because I think what you've just described is what we're talking about here is building systems that have low trust in the context of an organisation that is high trust.
Yeah.
So you create organisations where people can trust each other, work with each other really collaboratively, but equally you have systems that effectively have the guardrails around them because they have low trust. And historically, it's been the other way around, where you have systems that are high trust. So once you've got your password and you're in, you can do whatever you want. But they're operating in organisations that largely are low trust, where, as you say, people don't trust each other as colleagues. People don't trust each other across leadership teams. And actually, re-engineering organisations to have a level of trust in them is key to digital success, I think, because you cannot work productively as a team without a high level of cohesion and trust.
Yeah,
and I guess that's the point when we were saying about bringing the business and IT closer together. I think a lot of the time that where they are separated is there's so much friction because they don't trust each other.
I was just going to say, I think trust and creating trust and that culture change, it's not a simple touchy-feely thing. How do you get trust? You get trust because there's mutual understanding. You've got evidence built up over time that people will make decisions that are in line with your values. You've got a degree of transparency there and alignment on what you're trying to achieve as a group. So actually, these are all really tangible things. And often what you see in terms of an environment where bad decisions are being made or people are confused and not sure what's going on is it's not clear who's accountable for things. There might not be any clear ownership of data. That's a classic one. And people might not be sure who makes decisions. So actually simple stuff around sorting out really clear ownership of the things that matter, really clear accountability, demonstrating there's accountability there, and also focusing on what are our outcomes, how are we going to try and drive change and success together, and then putting energy into those and showing people that this stuff matters. Those have real business benefits and they create the right culture at the same time.
Yeah.
So you've got to drive the culture as part of driving really good outcomes for your business, and then it starts to work. And it's absolutely not just some comms exercise. And I do think people don't always realise that.
Of course. Like every time I talk to clients about transformation, they go, "Oh, culture, that's with HR."
Or comms.
Or comms. And I'm like, oh, well, it's not really. But, and I think there's a real underestimation of how important that part is, because the rest of it will still fall apart if you don't have that in place.
And that's more broad than anything to do with digital transformation. We are talking about how businesses operate at that point, right? It's if you have low trust, again, we're back to you're probably not making decisions quickly. If you've got low trust, you're not making decisions quickly, which means at some point, someone elsewhere in the market is going to outstrip you. They're going to take much larger slice of the market than you are, because fundamentally they're moving quicker because they are operating in a high trust environment. People are making decisions quicker and therefore are able to pick up new technologies, new business lines, etc. at a far greater pace. And one day the people who do work in these low trust organisations are likely to find themselves at a BlackBerry or somewhere similar, they're just not relevant anymore.
But let's
BBM.
not. I don't want anyone to think that high trust is blind trust. It's really not. I just want to really emphasise that it's not. Oh, we just all trust each other, so everyone can do whatever they like. It's kind of the opposite of that. It is about having really sort of data-driven, transparent, systematised guardrails for stuff, so that you know exactly how your organisation's protected.
And it goes back to the accountability piece. If you know who is responsible, who actually is the right person to make that decision, because they are accountable.
But it's
for
much more
doing so.
delegated, isn't it? In this kind of
it doesn't
environment.
all have to go back to one person in the organisation who says yes or no to everything. You need to have that delegated authority through. But
so you get far more decisions being made, far more frequently, lower down in the organisation, but with more data.
Yeah.
So you can see exactly what's happened.
And I'll be honest, I think a lot of organisations that I've worked with are still miles and miles away from that level of trust within an organisation. So I've worked with clients recently where every single decision still goes to a main board that sits every single month, and their board lasts for 2 days, where their whole leadership team sits in a board meeting for 2 days while they go through every single decision down to the tens of thousands of pounds, and it just paralyses the organisation from ever moving. And I think those sorts of cultural aspects or behavioural aspects, or even a lot of it does come down to personalities not wanting things to change. Even at a leadership level, even though they know it's good for their business, and ultimately they know that if they don't change and they don't move forward, their competitors will, and it will take them out of the marketplace. But the emotional journey people have to go on to do that is still quite high. So I guess it's just not an easy one that's answered overnight. But there are definitely, and we talked earlier about the smaller tactical things we can do from a technology perspective. But from a transformation perspective, there are things that can be done that are small and more tactical that kind of paves the way for moving into that. So, I mean, that organisation that I was talking about actually had change. They just got rid of the board meetings, and strangely enough it helped so well because decisions had to be made because there was no fallback to the board meeting that was going to happen in a month's time. So small tactical things like that, they can cause a bit of disruption at first, but they can also then create the wave of change that's needed for an organisation to want to do things differently.
I love how you just call getting rid of board meetings tactical.
Small tactical.
No offence against no joking.
But it's a really interesting point, right? That need to have a transformed culture in an organisation to support this is really important. I guess the challenge, for many say IT departments, CIOs, is that they're affecting a part of the organisation. They don't necessarily have the influence to change the culture of a whole organisation. So I guess
also doing this right, you need more capacity, not just in the IT department, which is often what's expected to lead the change, and they don't have the skills or capacity, and that creates fear and resistance to change. But you also need the capacity in the people they're working with to have a completely different conversation. So you have to build up skills in those different groups of people and capacity. And that's really before you start being able to see any results out the back end, which I guess is back to your earlier point.
So I guess with that, if we're thinking about an IT department that's operating in a context where they can only affect what they can affect, i.e. they can affect the culture within the IT team. I think there's still positive steps that can be taken there. They don't have to wait for the whole organisation to transform, although that would be helpful. What are some very practical things you think we could do? If you were a CIO of an organisation that needs to evolve to deliver at pace more, what are some things you might think about doing very practically to encourage that high trust environment?
I mean, there's always services under the control of the IT department where they can start to do things differently, start to engage users in a much more frequent conversation where they get much faster results, and use some good disciplines and best practices to do that. So, you can start to shift to a sort of product-centric model of delivery within your ITSM service model. That's something we see talked about quite a lot now. And actually a lot of the sort of core IT services have been transformed by the cloud into operating exactly this way. And so how you can adapt your core IT service model to be product-centric, to get new features and new value back out to your users more often, it's a pretty good way to lead by example in the IT department, and normally related to sort of service improvement objectives that the business will have for you anyway. So that's an easy place to get started. I mean, data and simple automation is another good one. You know, there's a lot of capability out there in terms of getting faster access to data, better quality insights from information. So things like that are easy ways the IT department can control. But I think it's pretty hard if there isn't a broader mandate and willingness to invest in fundamentally doing things differently.
Yeah, and I think that will slow down an organisation overall. I think there are more things that an IT organisation can do. One area of friction I often see is between operations and technical delivery, or engineering and operations. So you have I'm going to get a service chucked over the fence at the end of a project. That feels like an area where both trust can be built and friction can be reduced. I think the maybe more traditional service transition models are maybe a bit stretched at the moment, and that idea of collaborative teams. The other one is security, right? So the trust of, well, I know that person in engineering will never do that right, so I'm just going to deny them before they've even started. We might have seen that once or twice, Ryan.
Yeah, we might have seen it. We might have seen that a couple of times. I think with all of this, if we wanted to make one significant change quickly, get closer to the business, like really understand what they're trying to achieve, and that's the same for cybersecurity as it is for IT, etc. And try to get that shift to not saying no to being an enabler. I think if you can start to do that, you then start to get a license to operate, to be able to deliver something that's innovative and change it. And then people go, oh, actually, they don't just say no, and they're not just getting in the way. They're actually trying to help us do this better. I think because what gets measured gets done. And if an IT department or a cybersecurity department or any similar type service delivery organisation is just measured on it not going wrong, that is going to very much hamper any kind of change or digital adoption, because it's working today, it worked yesterday, don't change it because it might not work tomorrow. If you can get close to the business, and even if it's in very small tactical ways, to James's point about the data, if you can just give a level of metrics or reporting or something to that business so that it can make some change in that day-to-day operations that makes them more efficient, again, you're starting to build up that trust. You're starting to help the IT department or the cyber department get to a place where they're getting this license to operate. At that point, you're going to start having a two-way conversation, opposed to it just being I'm only measured on this not going wrong, therefore it can't go wrong, therefore I'm not going to change anything.
Not going to do anything, yeah, absolutely.
And I think when we were talking about moving to more of a product-based model, I think that kind of can also help build trust from it. You don't just have projects chucking stuff over the fence anymore. Because if we think about how we as users of consumer services, shall we say, my iPhone gets updated all the time. I mean, I logged onto Teams yesterday and it was all completely different. But I've become...
Great.
I was very confused. But I was confused for about 5 minutes and I got over it and carried on using Teams. So I think when users are used to things changing frequently and not dramatically, it's a lot more easier for them to consume it. So actually, and this is one of the benefits I think about product-based working, is you can have more of a release-based schedule where you're not constantly changing the game every year. You're incrementally tweaking things. It's just as exciting as when we get new emojis on iPhones.
I do think if you reorganise towards this kind of model, you can not only get better join up, you can also go faster without having as much overhead.
Yeah.
If I was just I was thinking about what Ryan said, get closer to the business, right? A classic way of doing that in an old-fashioned IT department is you hire more BRMs and more architects. So they spend more time having conversations around what do you need, where are we going, what's our roadmap. Actually, what this means is an awful lot more conversations for a lot of people. Diaries get clogged up. All of those teams who were already in place trying to do what they were doing before, now they've got more people to talk to. They've got to respond to more emails and more PowerPoints, and they've got to figure out how to join more dots together and meet even more expectations, right? Actually, if you don't do that, if instead what you do is reorganize, you're just having one continuous conversation around your core products and offerings, and you can do that in any sort of business, and have, there's very good lessons again from sort of big digital companies around how everything can work like this, and you flow the work through all of your teams, then actually, by nature of that reorganization, you're having the right conversations in a joined up way throughout the life cycle. So the problem is making the jump from an old way of working to a new one, and that's where you do need a surge in resource. But I think rather than sort of leaving existing teams untouched and then trying to put more over the top or doing more separately, you've got to have a sort of strategy for how you're going to do the transformation within your organisation as part of that. Otherwise, all you do is make everyone's life harder and create competing fiefdoms that try and fight for money and investment.
Yeah, and that's definitely a risk in organisations. I guess
kind of the problem with the bimodal approach, right?
Yeah,
just building a new on top of the old is it creates more work and more tensions.
Yeah, and more cost ultimately. Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the interesting things I've seen is the IT leaders or digital leaders who are most effective in an organisation do two things really well. One is they help the organisation to understand that digital transformation, or even the transformation of their part of the organisation, requires full organisation transformation. We've touched on that a little bit. And the other thing is they're great at involving and getting support from other executives around the board table. I think those two things are really key in an organisation that wants to be successful in making this change. So I think we've seen some organisations move from being traditional project-based organisations to having a much faster sort of experimentation framework that's putting out ideas that are then spun into products that deliver. We've seen pretty large organisations move into that way of working, but it does take quite a bit of time and a very different way of thinking. And one of the things I often hear is, people saying, the first time I had to go and tell the business that I need to have this much money, but I can't tell them exactly what they're going to get for it. It's a very challenging scenario. So it's interesting. How might you help someone who's thinking about having that conversation for the first time? What kind of things is it worth sort of I guess them building around that overall picture that says, look, we need to get a level of investment, some of it to improve the technology platform, other parts will give you some, you'll be able to see some things at the end of it, but I'm not sure exactly what it is. How would you frame that conversation?
I think it's got to be a partnership to try and build a better business that's better for everyone. So you can't just do this. We've just been saying that you need to get the buy-in from the other people, other senior stakeholders. And I think if you have that joint vision of what if we could go and offer a completely self-service online experience to our customers, what if we could get our products to market twice as often, and so if you've got that shared vision of doing something exciting that's different, then you can get that buy-in to try and put that investment in and see if that's possible. And that can get you started on that journey of doing something quite transformational and quite different.
Yeah, I think the other thing is maybe recognising that it's iterative as well. So although you are asking for a lot of investment, there will be various points that you can see value through that journey.
It's this idea of thinking big and delivering small. Isn't it? You need a big vision to inspire doing things really differently. But at the same time, if you do this stuff right, you can bite it off in quite small chunks so you can just adjust and learn as you go.
If you've got at the heart of your organisation a capacity to do innovation, prototyping, piloting things at pace, because everyone comes up with great ideas, and even if they are a great idea, it might not be the right organisation or the right time and things like that, and things get shelved. I think if you can very quickly, back to sort of getting that license to operate with the business, show value quickly. And some of those things will work out really well and other ones won't. But if you put all of your eggs in one basket and sort of say, we're going to do this fantastic, amazing thing before you're in that position where the business trusts you, you go, right, we're going to do this and we can't afford to fail and it's got to be right because this is how we move forward. I think then you're very likely for it to go wrong. And at that point, the business will say, well, this is why we weren't giving you sort of, for want of a better term, blind investment. This is why we want to understand exactly what you're doing with all your pounds, shillings and pence, because if you can't show value to us quickly with relatively sort of low pain, and that could be low cost or draw on resources, then I don't think that you're ever going to get that, and you're ever going to be able to drive it forward and change that agenda from then on.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. And we've got through a fair amount of this conversation without even mentioning AI. So probably should talk a bit of AI now. And I think it links actually quite nicely to this, in that I think part of this case for organisations, when you're making this case, is when there is game-changing technology that comes along, which, you know, I think we all recognise AI is and will be in some form, the organisation needs to be in the right place to adopt it. And I think, you know, coming back to what Faye said right at the beginning about building the right technology foundations for an organisation that can cope with change, AI is no different. You know, we see the examples every day of organisations that want to adopt AI, and we're actually having conversations about, well, you need to sort out your data, because actually, you know, what does AI build on if not data? And of course, you know, in the last year, there's been the explosion of generative AI. I think there's a really interesting factor here that says, you know, CIOs in many cases, or chief data officers in other cases, are being asked to accelerate the adoption of AI in their business. CISOs are being asked what they're doing with AI to make sure they are, you know, capturing threats in the most modern way possible and the most robust way possible. But there's a whole question about, have you got the foundations ready for your business for AI as well? And I think that's part, you know, yes, there's an investment question in there, but there's also, I guess, a fundamental, how do you start to show some value if you're being asked that question again as a CIO or a CISO? How do you start to answer that question for your business?
Just ask ChatGPT.
Ask ChatGPT, exactly.
That's almost exactly the same thing as I was thinking in some ways. So, I mean, in many ways, the problem around AI transformation is the same as all the other digital transformation stuff. Like most of what we've been talking about, you could apply to AI, and it is quite disruptive in terms of the things it lets you do that you couldn't easily do before. But in terms of the readiness piece, and why can't you just ask ChatGPT, right? What's the one thing your organisation's got? Actually, I think there's two things. Two things your organisation's got that someone else on the internet with ChatGPT hasn't got are your people and your data.
Yeah.
So how can you use that kind of technology differently to other people because of your people and your data? And that's the readiness point, because that's what your organization's got. I mean, it might have, you know, supply chain leverage or pre-existing market share or whatever it is, but, you know, other people on the internet can go and use ChatGPT to say, how do I do a better whatever? But they haven't got your people and they haven't got your data. So you need to get them ready for this era of AI adoption. And normally people are quite well managed. The problem is skills, culture, those sorts of things. But you know where they are, you know who controls them. With data, often what we see is there isn't really anyone who knows exactly what is where. And people, you know, if you haven't got that accountability, you don't really know what state it's in. So getting your data sorted is a key readiness step for any sort of AI. Whether it's like really, really big strategic, you're building a new business for a new sort of AI-based product, or you're just trying to do some cost out by making your people a little bit more productive with it. You can sort of go at any end of the spectrum, just as all the rest of the digital technologies have enabled us to do. Cloud, all these sorts of things, big data. There's similar sorts of potential for disruption from the small to the big, cost out, new markets. But, you know, the fundamentals are, what are your assets? What makes you special as a business? And that could be, you know, contracts, people, data. Those are the sorts of things you need to think about. How do we really get into a great shape with those? How do we get them fighting fit for the next wave of digital, which is AI? So
I was just going to say, I think generative AI is probably going to hurt more organisations or more CIOs, CTOs, digital officers, etc., probably more than anything else recently. If you just see all of your colleagues are consumers in the day-to-day business, day-to-day lives, and Faye alluded to it earlier, right? If you just sit in an ad break at the moment, you're going to see a laptop that's got AI, you're going to see a phone, you're going to see this, that, and the other. Would almost liken it to, it's like before everybody had email, but what if everybody had email in their home and they didn't have it in the office? People will be using it, and unfortunately, it's unlikely to be well governed, etc. Because if the business is saying no, they are just on the internet, they are just using ChatGPT, they are picking up your data and they are putting it places that you wouldn't want it to be. So I think it's going to be something that in the next 12 to 18 months, if not all organisations have got their arms around it. There is going to be such a drive from all the colleagues in the organisation trying to use it or want its adoption that it's probably going to push harder than most things have over the last 10 to 15 years.
It's a
But they'll do
cumulative
it
thing.
anyway.
They'll just do it anyway.
Yeah. It's got the thing with the whole the way the AI ecosystem's evolving is it's got all the problems of cloud from an organizational governance and change point of view. It's got all the problems of data and then it's just an extra level on top. So all the same security stuff applies. All the you zero trust, the challenges around losing control over what's going on and where. Losing sort of transparency into how the data's being used. All of these risks are there. It just takes it on another level further. And I feel like our customers haven't sort of embedded and learnt the lessons from the previous ways of disruption. And now here's another accelerator coming on just to take it up to another level. So, I think you're going to see even more disruption in businesses caused by this, because the ones that have learnt how to do this will just be massively further ahead of the curve than the ones who haven't really started getting properly digital.
Yeah, and I guess one of the key things around AI is it's not the future, it's now. And a lot of organisations, I think, go and say, oh, what an amazing thing that's coming. I mean, it's here and it's happening and everyone is doing it anyway. So, like you say, I mean, I see all the time, you're not allowed to have ChatGPT on a corporate laptop, so they just have it on their phones. Or there's all these other different ways and people will do it whether you say they can or can't.
Yeah, and I don't, and this will sound slightly controversial coming from me, but I actually think the risk is far more than the data being somewhere that it shouldn't be. I think it's more to do with the potential business operations that might happen. So some worked example. So if you get a hallucination, so it tells you something that it shouldn't, for example.
Is that AI that has hallucinations?
Indeed, yes. So you can, if you're not instructing your people on how to use this, it's not just an IT, it's not just a security problem, because they might be asking advice from something and they don't really know the output of which is being presented to them. They might provide advice. There's been cases of lawyers, etc., that have cited case law that never happened, which is very problematic in a court. But that's just one example of how that could be being used.
There's so many. You think about people making decisions on, benefits claims, immigration cases. You mentioned court cases. Like there could be stuff within the health service. Like pretty much any business, there's stuff that has massive potential impact on people's lives. If you're using technology to make decisions, you don't know how it works. You're not suitably skilled to make a judgment on whether what it's saying is correct. Yeah. You don't have those, as you say, business process guardrails in place. Yeah. And the reality is that we haven't got a good way to explain the decisions of large language models. We just don't. So there's a massive difference there where even if it's right more of the time than a person can be accountable for explaining their decisions. An algorithm can't. Yeah. So that's really that makes that is a huge problem in terms of moving business processes onto AI.
And it's an interesting thing you see. Probably, I've talked to a fair few different sort of both IT and security leaders who point out that increasingly, we're moving from models where there is, I guess, responsibilities held in different places to individual accountability. So as an individual, you have to take accountability for the thing you do and the decision you make, whether that is, do I transfer data from A to B, i.e. I'm sending information that might be classified or in some way sensitive to the company that I'm in, and I send it out of the business. I'm taking individual accountability for making that decision. And equally, therefore, I'm taking individually the responsibility. If something goes wrong with that, that's my, that could be in some cases a disciplinary action or something else. And seeing more and more organisations having to rely on those sort of mechanisms because actually the impact of technology is so wide, and the ability for, and the need for people to have a level of responsibility about what they're doing. So what should be being done is you could use these tools as effectively assistive technology to support you in doing your role, but you need to check, does that case actually exist? Do you need to check, is it citing a fact that, or a person that, that didn't actually exist? You need to check that, if, as I've heard in some businesses, people are using using generative AI to fill out supply chain forms, for example, that it's actually filling them out, factually correct manner. Now, it's great if you can do that and you use it as output to give you an acceleration, but that individual responsibility, and then how do you to make sure that happens at a organisational scale, especially if you're an organisation of hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people? How do you do that? I think that's the big challenge that CIOs, CISOs, and their teams are going to be grappling with now. But as you say, you can't turn off these tools, because if you do, people will use them in a less safe, more challenged way. So it comes back to education, where I think we started some of the conversation is, how do you increase data literacy, digital literacy, AI literacy in your organisations, and cyber literacy? How do you do these things in a safe manner? And I think the better we get at doing that, it'll have quite far-reaching consequences, not least people being more secure and safe in their overall lives.
I think it just comes back to all the things we've talked about. You need to include all of the right stakeholders and expertise throughout that process of trying to make that adaptation. If you think of your business process as your product, you need a good reason for why you're going to start using LLM in it. It may be pretty obvious, Copilot, Gemini, whichever one you're using. You need to involve people who are experts in the threat profile to your business from the off, all of the different sort of GRC functions. And I think, I might be putting words into your mouth, but what you were saying earlier, Ryan, about it not being so much about where the data is or cybersecurity, I agree with that. So it's all these other aspects of risk to your business that are really important. You need to be thinking about those, and alongside the people who are going to be using it. You need that expertise linked in with the realities of the people doing the work on the ground with the tooling. Yeah. So your product team has almost no technologists in it at all, really. It's people who are experts in how your business works, what's possible, what the risks and threats are. And then down underneath that, the actual sort of tech teams, probably from Microsoft or Google or someone else commoditizing the technology. OpenAI somewhere at the bottom of it, building the LLM or Google. It's a very, very, and that actually, look, that's just that little example is a really good example of how digital works, because almost all of the tech is somewhere else. You're building on that ecosystem. So it's running on Google Cloud or Azure or whatever it is. You don't even know what that architecture looks like, how many VMs they've got or other, containers or whatever down in the guts of that. You just see a user interface integrated into Office or whatever. But actually the trick is, how do you use that? And that needs loads and loads of different skills to come together to think about transforming your business. And when you look at how do you roll it out, you've got to be thinking about the business case differently, the investment, and integrating all of that with the risk perspective. So that whole AI adoption is a nice little example of all those different sorts of things we've just talked about in terms of different boundaries between business and IT. Yeah, and actually where most of the technological work happens is in somewhere different in that supply chain. So different life cycle, different way of people communicating with each other, and totally different sorts of outcomes. Yeah. And you end up with a kind of fusion between, the AI and the people in the business operations. And that's all going to have to iterate as well as the technology evolves and becomes more capable.
But it's to your point earlier as well, James, I think, which is this stuff is going to make change happen quicker. So if you are not really in the right place when it comes to digital change and adoption already, then when AI hits you, wow, that's really going to hit you. That's really going to be problematic for your business. Because if you're still mentally 10, 15 years, you've got your own servers, your own kit, you're still doing all of that, AI comes down the track, you're either not going to be able to adopt it at all, or we're back to people will just use it anyway. Or if you're not in the position where actually you have got the guardrails in place, you do have a high trust environment, your business is able to change, you have productized stuff, you are heading in the right direction at pace. As AI is starting to come into this agenda, that's going to be very problematic, because if you're not even at that stage yet, when this turns up, it's going to be very, very problematic for the organisation.
But I talk to a lot of IT professionals and IT departments where you look at how to stop looking after the servers and whether that's worth it, and the numbers don't look like they add up. right? And so they keep their data centers. And we have loads of customers like that.
Yeah.
But, when you step back and you're having this sort of quite strategic discussion, you're going, well, of course you don't want to have to worry about that stuff. If you're thinking about Copilot adoption and changing your business processes, there's, a bunch of settings in a Microsoft portal somewhere for configuring it. And that's about it from a tech point of view. Like, there's really not very much to do. And there's this transformative business advantage potentially there, right? And you've got to coordinate that. So your digital team absolutely should be on top of that, driving it, thinking about comms, business process change. There's no servers involved at all. And that's where the massive value is. And our IT departments are stuck worrying about keeping the lights on for a few hundred servers.
Yeah.
They're just totally different worlds. And I think that's still the sort of fundamental challenge for a lot of our customers, isn't it?
And that's one of the things we haven't covered yet, which is the people aspect and making sure that you have got those people who are knowledgeable, do understand. If they're still worried about sticking cables in the back of a rack and we're having a conversation about digital transformation, cloud, AI, etc., then you're going to have inherently resistance to change because you haven't got the people, you haven't upskilled them or changed them or supported their journey moving forward into that new adoption.
I think that's right. Yeah. So you've got the sort of broad digital data, AI literacy across an organisation, but you've also got the reskilling and transformation of people within the within IT organisations, within digital organisations, and I think it is possible. We've seen over the last few years many. This is my favourite sort of thing to say at the moment. Many network engineers re-engineer themselves as cybersecurity engineers over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, and equally many infrastructure engineers moving into DevOps, and so there is that ability for people to evolve, but they need to be given time and space by the organisations they are in to do that. And I think that's the important thing is, organisations need to think about their education of their whole team. But too often, and that being the whole business, but too often the digital team is sort of left behind a little bit in that as paradigms shift, as technology changes. And there's a real need, I think, for that, strategic thought about investment into that internal capability. Otherwise, you end up in this place where you're having to continually refresh your team, and it's a rising cost. It's not going to be, it's not the most effective way to do it, and you lose also a huge amount of organisational intelligence and corporate memory on the organisation.
Yeah, it's almost like the point where we were talking about earlier. If you don't invest in your technology landscape, then the investment becomes too high every time you do a change. It's almost exactly the same in your people landscape. So if you don't continuously develop your people in line with the way the technology is developing, then the gap is then too big. So you can't just jump from being completely server-based, everything's under complete local control, to everything being in the cloud and expect everyone to still know what to do. Yeah. And that jump is sometimes too high, which means people have to be changed around. And that has a massive emotional aspect to it for a lot of people in organisations, but also it's expensive and you've got to spend ages training people up on how the business works. So I guess that incremental investment from a technology, people and process perspective is fundamental, rather than letting it almost get out of hand and then having to be like a complete revolution of how you do everything.
Yeah, if I could make a couple of points. One is, this isn't a problem you can outsource, which might sound strange coming from a consultancy. You have to build the capability for this internally. And actually, I just still think back to that AI piece, core assets, people and data, that you've really got to invest in your people for the long term around your strategy. So think about what's those long-term digital capabilities that will make your business more successful. Have a roadmap for all of your people towards that. And if you can see what, you've got to tell the story. This was the other point I was going to make, is you need to have a really strong vision and everyone can join up around that. So if they can see a way forward for them to that future and they know why you're doing that and they trust that they're part of that story, then they will help drive you forwards. And I think, any good consultancy nowadays, like we talk about this a lot, you have to leave your customer stronger than when you started, because it's the only sensible way to do it. Otherwise, you're creating more problems for the future. That just sort of builds on what you were saying.
So I think that's been a very interesting discussion, firstly. Thank you all. Before we wrap up, what's one thing that you would recommend if you're a CIO, a CISO, a leader, someone who's helping to run an IT department today, and you're sort of looking at this problem and going, there's a lot here to do, what's one thing that you'd all recommend to do today that could help you move forward a little bit? Just put you on the spot, each in turn. James?
Yeah, I think I'd go with the point I've come back to a couple of times, which is focus on your people and your data. How can you protect and invest in those assets to make them used effectively for your business long term? So think long term, invest in people and data, and think about how to take action that can be measured in small chunks against that big vision.
Brilliant. Thank you. Faye?
I would say, as a leader of the organisation, whether you're a CIO or a CISO, really bringing along all of the other leaders of the organisation into the shared vision about what you're trying to do. Tim, I think you mentioned it earlier, every successful CIO you've seen has actually done that very well. So I'd say that's something that's quite often overlooked, and I think is one of the more powerful moves for a CIO or CISO to do.
Ryan?
And mine won't have anything to do with cyber. I'll go back to get close.
Those networks.
Get close to the business. Make sure that you've got a team there, and we've covered it about the people and the process aspect for a fair amount of this, but make sure that you're actually answering the questions that are being posed by the organisation. Nobody wants to spend time, money and resource answering questions that nobody's asking.
Brilliant. Thank you. So thank you very much for listening to this episode of the FSP podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's given you some answers in how you might navigate the digital landscape and be able to take your organisation to the next level. There'll be more content from us coming soon, so please do stay tuned to our channel. Thank you.